Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side. Hello and welcome back to Fuck That. I hope you had a very happy Halloween. I ate a lot of food, lied on the couch, and tried to watch Five Nights at Freddy's, but I fell asleep because it sucked. So today I am going to dive into a case that has been haunting the snowy expanses of Russia for over 6 decades. Actually, really quickly before I dive in, just know that this takes place in Russia. It was the Soviet Union at the time. I did look up how to pronounce everything, the names, the locations, but Russian is a very difficult language to speak if you don't speak Russian. And these words are insanely hard to pronounce. So yeah, just know I put in a lot of effort into researching the pronunciation, but it's probably going to be really bad. Just know the effort is there. Deep in the heart of the Ural Mountains, 9 experienced hikers set out on a winter adventure, only to end up meeting an inexplicable fate. Between the 1st of February and the 2nd of February of 1959, an event occurred in which these 9 Soviet hikers died under uncertain circumstances. These deaths have sparked debates that go on still to this day, and they also sparked a lot of theories, similar to the Bennington Triangle episode. Some of these theories are certainly way more plausible than others, but we're going to dive into that today as well. This is the story of the infamous Dyatlov Pass incident. In January of 1959, a group of young Soviet hikers, which was led by then 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, embarked on a trek through the Ural Mountains. They were students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were full of life, passion, and a thirst for adventure. However, little did they know, their journey would end in mystery that still lingers on to this day. So Igor put this group together with the idea of wanting to have a challenging skiing and hiking expedition across the Northern Ural Mountains. And these were located within what at the time was known as Sverdlovsk Oblast in the Soviet Union. Try saying that 3 times fast as an American. Whew. Anyway, today that area is called Yekaterinburg. So the 10 people within the group, most of them were students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, which is how Igor knew them. And that's also now known as the Ural Federal University. And like I mentioned before, this group, they had passion for adventure. You could also say that they were very ballsy. But additionally, what was impressive about them is that they were skillful at going on these expeditions. The entire group, they were grade 2 hikers. At the time, this has changed since then, grade 3 was the highest certification available. And once the group had returned from this expedition that they were planning, they were all set to obtain that grade 3 certification. In order to obtain that certification, just to give you an idea of how difficult it is, one person has to cover at least 330 kilometers, which is around 190 miles. That's a lot, especially in that kind of terrain. According to documents that were allegedly discovered later after this incident, this expedition had been named in honor of the 21st Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which could suggest that there might have been some kind of organizing or endorsement by the local Komsomol organization, which is the youth division of the Communist Party. At the time, this was a very politically charged atmosphere within Russia, so who knows whether it's true or not, but it is a very popular theory. The group did design their own route, and this route would take them through some of the most remote regions of Sverdlovsk Oblast. It would then follow the stream of the Lazva River, but the ultimate destination was the Otorten Mountain, which was a place whose name very ominously translates to "don't go there" in the local indigenous Mansi language. And this was about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles north from where the site of the incident would unfold. On January 8th of 1959, the Sverdlovsk City Route Commission officially approved the group's plan, which recognized a group of 10 individuals. And this journey was deemed, again, they were trying to achieve this certification. So this journey was deemed as a Category 3 route, which was the most difficult. To add on to that, because that's obviously not difficult enough, this expedition was set to occur in the beginning of February, which is when the terrain was the most treacherous. But again, these 10 individuals were about to be experts, so it probably just sounds a lot harder to somebody like me that just sits at home on my ass all day. On the 23rd of January, the group collected their route book, which delineated course number 5. And this was the same day where a man named Semyon, he went by Sasha Zolotaryov, decided to join the expedition. Sasha was an older gentleman compared to the group. He came off as a somewhat mysterious figure, but Sasha had already possessed his grade 3 certification. So this obviously meant that he had some expertise that perhaps this group lacked that he could bring to the table. And so he had planned to go on another expedition with his own group, but that ended up falling through last minute, and thus the group now had a 10th person. The group departed from Sverdlovsk that same day, which was January 23rd. But before I go on to the expedition, I want to talk about each member of the expedition crew, starting with Igor Dyatlov, who was the leader of the group. And this is the man where, obviously, it's called the Dyatlov Pass, would later be named after. Igor was born into a family of engineers, and he was a radio engineering student at the Polytechnic Institute. Igor was born on January 13th of 1936, and he was only 23, but he represented the essence of a very driven and passionate leader. His scientific curiosity and his strong leadership skills were the driving force behind the expedition. Lyudmila Lyuda Dubinina was the youngest. At the time of the expedition, she was only 20 years old. She was studying economics at the Polytechnic Institute, but she was known to be a complete badass, even though she was only 20. She ended up going on a hiking trip with some friends prior to this incident, and one of the people that was there mishandled a hunting rifle and accidentally shot her in the leg, and she couldn't walk. So she had to be carried over 50 miles through this part of the Siberian forest, and her companions at the time that had to carry her said that even though she had this massive injury, she did everything she could to maintain high spirits on the way out. Zeneda Kalmogorova was a day younger than Igor, so she was born January 12th, 1936, and she was known to be very bright and energetic. She also studied radio engineering like Igor and was known to bring a spark of liveliness to a group, in addition to all of the technical skills that she had. There are several Yuris in this group, so I'm going to refer to all of them by first and last name. Otherwise, how else can we differentiate? But Yuri Yudin, who was 21 at the time, loved exploring, and he was a geology student. I didn't get into this yet, but I'll explain it in more detail once I'm done going over the people in the group. But he ends up leaving prior to the expedition, which thankfully allowed him to live a very long life. He didn't pass away until he was age 75. Yuri Krivonashenko, who was known as Georgie, was another 23-year-old in the group who was known to be absolutely hilarious. He also loved to play music, so he was the group comedian and the group musician. Rustem Slobodin, known as Rustic, shared the same birthday with Igor. He was a mechanical engineer by training. Again, same birthday as Igor, so he was 23, but he also really enjoyed music, just like Yuri. He typically would bring his mandolin where he went and he would play music for his friends. So this next name, I've seen two different spellings across multiple sources, either Alexander or Alexander. I'm so bad at saying that name, but Aleks. I'm pretty sure that that's probably what it is because I think Alexander with an X is the American version of that name. So it's probably the latter, but I don't know if just because the sources that I was reading were written in English that that's how the spelling was. But anyway, Alexander Kolevatov, who was initially the eldest in the group prior to Sasha arriving, he was a 24-year-old nuclear physicist who loved smoking his antique pipe. This next name I'm having the hardest time with because it's French and that language is beautiful but very challenging to me. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles. I know I said that wrong. I did look up the pronunciation. If you speak French, please don't hate me. But he was a 23-year-old who was sophisticated but very, very funny. He had an academic background in industrial civil construction, but he was also known to be very well read in basically everything, not just industrial civil construction. And then the last member of the group that had joined right before they were about to leave was Semyon Sasha Zolotaryov. He was 38 at the time. In 1950, Sasha graduated from the Institute of Physical Education in Minsk, which is an insanely hard word for me to pronounce, even though I've heard it 10,000 times because that's where Phoebe's ex-boyfriend lived. So he graduated in 1950, but he also had a military career during which he received 4 military awards. After a long train ride, the group arrived in Ivdo, which is a town at the heart of the northern province of Sverdlovsk, and they arrived on January 25th of 1959. They then made their way via truck to the northern village of Vizhai, and this village is the last inhabited settlement to the north. And it was here that the group took the opportunity to rest, so they spent the night. And they decided that they were going to stock up on loaves and eat loaves of bread in order to build up their energy for their upcoming trek. So the official date of the expedition beginning was January 27th, but the next day, the 28th, Yuri Yudin decided that he was going to leave and he was not going to go on the expedition. Now, Yuri already had health issues. He had a congenital heart defect as well as rheumatism. So while he began this expedition with the group or traveling leading up to it, he had a lot of joint pain, particularly knee pain. So Yuri decided to turn back, and this was a decision that left a very long-lasting impact on his life. Yuri did experience a lot of survivor's guilt, according to a lot of sources, but he did participate in the investigation following what happened. But the events from that day up until when the remaining 9 passed away was not entirely clear and had to be pieced together based on evidence that was uncovered during the investigation. So this is what investigators surmised based on personal diaries and cameras found at what would later be known as the last campsite. On January 31st, the group reached a highland area and they started to prepare for the ascent. The group stashed surplus supplies in a wooded valley and they marked it so that way they could identify where it was during their return journey. And this is something that's common practice with experienced hikers. They do this so that way they can lighten their load during the ascent or the most difficult part of the trek. On February 1st, they came upon the pass and they were fully intent on conquering it and setting up the camera on the other side, but nature had other plans for the group. The weather ended up deteriorating very rapidly in that area, and a brutal snowstorm reduced visibility to essentially nothingness. There were fierce winds, and that likely disoriented the group. Because of this, the group inadvertently veered west towards the peak of Kholat Syakhl, and in Mansi, this means Dead Mountain. So we've got Don't Go There and Dead Mountain. At this point, it is likely that the group had realized their mistake and was forced with a really critical decision. They could either descend to a forested area, which is about 1.5 kilometers away, and that's just shy of a mile away, which could offer some protection from the elements, or they could make camp where they were on the mountainside. Yuri Yudin, the man that ended up leaving early, later hypothesized that Igor probably decided to make camp there on the mountainside in order to maintain the altitude that the group had already achieved or to simulate an emergency scenario. So it is highly likely, but not confirmed, that he did choose to camp on the open slope. The camp that the group established on that slope would be their final encampment, and the exact events of what transpired after this point remains a mystery, as the 9 hikers would never make it out of the mountains alive. After this day that they set up camp on the slope of the mountain, which was February 1st, the group was not heard from again. Prior to the trek, Igor Dyatlov had arranged to send a telegram to their sports club once the group returned to Vizhai, which was expected to happen no later than February 12th. However, February 12th came and February 12th went, and they did not receive any messages from Igor or the group. And initially, this didn't cause concern because commonly in expeditions like this, especially expeditions that took place during the months when the expeditions were more treacherous, delays or unforeseen circumstances could occur that could cause the expeditions to take longer. So it wasn't until February 20th when the families of the hikers demanded a rescue operation. So the first search party was actually sent out by the Polytechnical Institute, where the hikers were students, and they organized the first search parties, which comprised of volunteer students and volunteer teachers. And the operation escalated quickly as the seriousness of the situation became evident, which then prompted the Soviet Army and the militia, which is the police force, to deploy resources, which included planes and helicopters and obviously boots on the ground to search the area. On February 26th, 2 searchers from the Institute discovered the group's tent on the slopes of the mountain, and the tent was not in good shape. According to an account of one of the students who found it, he said, quote, "The tent was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty and all of the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind," end quote. So because the group's belongings and shoes were left behind, this suggested that they left the tent suddenly and frantically because they did so without resources, and they did so to go into sub-zero temperatures outside without these resources. I'm going to just jump ahead to the investigation. I'm going to talk about this in detail later, but a lot of weird things happened with the records of the incident being archived and what have you, but a lot of those were released, and apparently they were kind of comprised into 2 volumes of books, essentially by the Dyatlov Foundation. You can find these online. I did link it in the show notes. It's all obviously written in Russian, so you have to find a website that translates it and then make sure that it's an accurate translation. But I wanted to read an excerpt from one of the written reports regarding the campsite. And it says, quote, "The campsite is located 300 meters from the top of the mountain on a slope of 30 degrees. The campsite is a snow-leveled area with 8 pairs of skis at the bottom. The tent is stretched out on ski poles, fixed with ropes. 9 backpacks with various personal belongings of the group members were laid down at the bottom of the tent. Quilted jackets, storm jackets were put on top. 9 pairs of felt boots were found where the heads must have been. Men's trousers were also found, and 3 pairs of felt boots, warm fur coats, socks, hats, ski caps, utensils, buckets, stove, axe, saw, blankets. Then it goes on to list the food: biscuits in 2 bags, condensed milk, sugar concentrates, notebooks, itinerary, and many other small items and documents. And then it lists cameras and accessories to a camera. Approximately 20 yards from the tent, the investigators were able to find 9 sets of footprints that were visible. Some of the prints were large and others were much smaller, which suggested to investigators that the person that left those particular tracks was likely barefoot. The footprints went on for about a half mile towards the river valley, and at some point the footprints ended up splitting into 2 separate but parallel pathways. These 2 separate pathways then continued towards the valley, but then they met up again and merged back together into one track. And the investigators followed the tracks until they were unfortunately covered up by a fresh patch of snow. Not too far from camp, there is a border of woods. I keep saying investigators, but I mean searchers. The searchers were the ones that followed the footprints. The searchers also then ended up coming across a large cedar tree at the border of the woods, and they found there remnants of a makeshift fire. I think they found some embers and then dug a little bit because there was some fresh snowfall, and then found remnants of a makeshift fire that was partially covered by the snow. So they kept searching in that area, and on February 27th of 1959, searchers found the first 2 bodies of Georgy and Yuri Doroshenko. The men were found laying side by side. Both Yuri and Georgy did not have on jackets or pants. Yuri was dressed in a checkered shirt and swimming trunks on top of long underwear, and the long underwear had the left leg torn off. His right foot was exposed out of the snow, with snow packed in between his toes. Georgy was found with a little bit more clothing on. He had on an undershirt, a checkered shirt, long underwear, briefs, and socks. But with both men, their clothing was heavily tattered and there were pieces missing, which left their skin exposed. Yuri was found lying prone with his arms under his head, and there were broken cedar branches underneath him, and Georgy was supine facing the sky. There was damage to Georgy's eyes and mouth. That same day, in a line between the cedar tree and the tent, the frozen bodies of Igor Dyatlov, Zeneta Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin were found at intervals of 300, 480, and 630 meters. These distances are roughly a quarter of a mile, a third of a mile, and then just under half of a mile apart. And that's not exact, but I don't feel like saying 0.18, 0.3, so it's close enough. You get the idea. Right after the first 5 bodies were found, a legal inquest started, and forensic examinations of the discovered hikers occurred on 2 different dates, actually, the first being March 4th and the second being March 9th. And at the conclusion of that, it was determined that all 5 of the hikers died from hypothermia. Rustem did have a small crack in his skull, but it was not considered enough to be a fatal wound. And they did also examine the tent, and investigators were able to determine that the tent was cut from the inside by a knife in 3 separate places. And this suggested to investigators that the hikers were likely escaping the tent in an abrupt and very sudden panic. Throughout March and April, the search for the remaining hikers continued, but that didn't end until 2 months later, on May 4th, although some sources say May 5th, so to be honest, I'm unclear whether it was the 4th or 5th, but it is on one of those days that the remaining 4 members of the group were finally uncovered, and they were buried under 4 meters of snow, which is over 13 feet of snow, and they were found in a ravine, which was another 75 meters, which is approximately 250 feet from that cedar tree where they had found the embers and discovered the first two bodies. This discovery actually came about after searchers noticed branches that seemed out of place under the snow in that ravine. And not too far from there, one of the volunteers found a piece of clothing. So the team decided to dig a hole above the creek bed, and they eventually uncovered a cache of clothing, and some of the clothing seemed to have been either cut or shredded. And they continued their search and eventually discovered Lyuda, Nikolai, Sasha, and Alexander. The discovery of the last four hikers altered perceptions about what had happened to these individuals, mainly just because of the state that they were found in. Three of them sustained fatal injuries. Nikolai had severe skull damage. Lyuda and Sasha had significant chest fractures, but they didn't have what appeared to be external injuries. They suffered soft tissue damage to their heads and faces, and Lyuda was missing her tongue, eyes, parts of her lips, facial tissue, and a skull fragment. Sasha's eyes additionally were gone, and Alexander was missing eyebrows with signs that indicated post-mortem injuries due to their placement in running water. Because of how long they have been left out, the first bodies were found in February and it's now May. In addition to the fact that they were kept in this running water, they really had to rush to get these bodies off of the mountain and into a morgue for autopsy. Something else that set these hikers apart from the first hikers that were found was that they were a lot more adequately dressed than the previous hikers, but in spite of that, they were still very much inadequately dressed for the temperatures. The conditions were freezing. It was between minus 25 to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is minus 13 to minus 22 Fahrenheit. The weather was stormy, and even though they had more clothes on than the previous, some of them only had one shoe, others just had socks. But something that was weird about this group was they had the torn and tattered clothing, but they also had clothing on from some of the other hikers that had already perished. What was determined during the investigation was that 6 of the group members died of hypothermia and the rest had fatal injuries. There was a lot of chatter, and it's one of the theories, but I'm not going to entertain it because it's fucked up, that the indigenous Mansi people were involved, and there's no evidence to support this. They do not have any history of violence, and they were able to determine that there were no indications of anybody else nearby the group, apart from the 9 travelers. They were also able to determine that the tent was ripped from within with a knife in 3 different areas. The victims had died between 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. I'm not really sure how accurate that is today, but this is 1959. Pretty sure that GI contents are considered junk science now, but I digress. Traces from the camp showed that all group members left the campsite of their own accord and on foot, and there were some levels of radiation found on one of the victims' clothing. Initially, the official verdict was that the hikers died due to a, quote, compelling natural force, end quote, which led to the closure of the investigation in May of 1959, the same month that they found the last remaining hikers. And they did not identify anybody responsible. The case files were then classified and sent to a secret archive. So we're going to jump from 1959 to 1997, when it was revealed that Yuri Krivonishenko's camera negatives were kept secretively by one of the investigators, and these negatives were later given to the Dyatlov Foundation by his daughter. In 2009, the hikers' diaries were released to the public. In 2018, Sasha's remains were exhumed, and this allegedly produced some really strange results. The injury pattern that he had seemed to be very similar to that of a car crash, but what's weird is allegedly the DNA tests did not match his supposed relatives, which then raised doubts about his identity and if he was really who he said he was. And supposedly his name was also missing from cemetery records, but they did do a facial reconstruction, which confirmed that the skull that was exhumed resembled photographs of Sasha. Russian authorities reopened the case in 2019, but they only did so considering only natural causes such as avalanches or a hurricane. So the investigation excluded any option of foul play. But before I get into the conclusion of that investigation, I want to cover some of the theories that have come out of this incident. The first being katabatic wind. So in 2019, there was a Swedish-Russian expedition that was made to the site, and they then proposed that this incident likely occurred due to a violent katabatic wind. These are rare events, but they can be extremely violent, and these winds were the cause of a 1978 case at a mountain in Sweden where 8 hikers were killed and one of them was severely injured. Apparently, the topography of both of these locations, where this incident occurred and where the incident in Sweden occurred, are very similar. If the group did suffer an incident where they experienced this kind of wind, it would have been impossible for them to remain in the tent. So in that event, the hikers would have covered the tent with snow, potentially, and then sought shelter, perhaps behind the tree line, something that would give them some kind of safety from the wind. A lot of sources do say that there was a flashlight found on top of the tent, which could indicate that the group did this so that when they left the tent, they could eventually navigate back to the tent. So the group that conducted this expedition and came up with this theory believed that the hikers left the tent and then went off and constructed 2 temporary shelters, one of which collapsed, which could have explained the hikers that were found buried with severe injuries. Another theory involves infrasound, and this was put out by the author of one of the books I read for this, which is in the show notes. And apparently, he thinks that this is the wind that was going around the mountain at the time, and this created what is known as a Kármán vortex. And this is a repeating pattern of swirling vorticles, which is caused by vortex shedding. And apparently this is the sound that you hear when, back in the day, if you're a 90s kid like I am, every car had a huge antenna, just a giant antenna sticking out of it. And when you would travel at high speeds down a highway, this antenna would vibrate and sometimes make like that weird singing sound. And this is that, but on a much larger scale if it was a mountain. Apparently, this phenomena can produce infrasound, and infrasound is capable of causing panic attacks in humans. So in the book, the author suggests that the infrasound was generated by the wind as it passed over the top of the mountain, which then caused the sound, which then caused extreme physical discomfort and mental distress in the hikers. This then caused them to panic, retreat from the tent, and go down the slope. But once they were there, they would have been put out of the sound path and would have regained their composure. However, whether they regained their composure or not, they are now down at the bottom of that slope and it is dark. So they likely could not have figured out a way to get back to their shelter. Another hypothesis suggested that the campsite was within the path of a Soviet parachute mine exercise, and it suggests that the group was startled awake by explosions that caused them to then flee the tent in a panic, and they were unable to return to camp. Now, there are records that indicate that parachute mines were being tested in the area of the campsite at the time of when the hikers were there. Parachute mines are unique in a sense that they detonate in the air prior to hitting the ground, and when they cause injury, they produce injuries similar to some of the injuries that were found among some of the hikers. So these mines can cause very heavy internal damage, but you might not see all of that external trauma. There is another military theory that involves radiological weapons, and this probably came from the fact that they found some radioactive materials on one of the hikers' clothing. But if this was the case, it wouldn't just be on one person's clothing. They would have all been exposed. So I think that this is just complete shit. The last theory, I wouldn't even call this a theory because this is something that actually happens, but it's paradoxical undressing. So when somebody has moderate to severe hypothermia, paradoxical undressing can occur. And the reason of that is because hypothermia can cause confusion. And you have somebody that's confused and disoriented, sometimes they end up undressing when they are moderately or severely hypothermic. 6 of the 9 hikers did undisputedly die of hypothermia, but some of the members of the groups had on more clothing than others. So this could be an indication that they were not confused and knew to add layers, but there's really no way to confirm or not. So in 2019, when Russia opened up the new investigation, the official cause of death of the 1959 Dyatlov Pass incident was declared as of July 2020 to be an avalanche. This conclusion was supported by computer simulations and a detailed review by Russian investigators. And according to this theory, the Dyatlov group made an emergency evacuation from their tent due to the threat of an avalanche on the slope where they made their tent, and they then tried to take shelter in the woods. From there, they believe that the subsequent actions that they took, which included starting a fire and potentially digging a snow cave, were consistent with what was known to be the standard survival practices. But unfortunately, in spite of what they did, they were unable to survive the harsh conditions. There was a study that was led by scientists from Zurich, which was published in 2021, that suggested that a type of avalanche known as a slab avalanche could potentially explain some of the trekkers' injuries. But this theory has been contested for a very long time due to several factors, such as the absence of physical evidence for an avalanche. There was none. There have been over 100 expeditions to that site since 1959 without similar conditions. And additionally, these hikers, remember from the beginning of the episode, they were grade 2 certified, one certification away from being at the highest certification. So with that kind of experience, it's pretty hard to believe that they would set up camp on a slope in the path of a potential avalanche. However, the investigation by the investigative committee of the Russian Federation nonetheless upheld the avalanche theory, and they attributed the tragedy to severe weather conditions, poor decision-making, and the group splitting up, which then made their vulnerable situation even worse. The Federation also noted that the investigation that was conducted in 1959 was severely flawed, which led to many unresolved questions and paved the way for conspiracy theories. Following the incident, a mountain pass in the area was later named Dyatlov Pass in memory of the group. In many languages, the incident is now referred to as the Dyatlov Pass incident. However, the incident occurred about 1,700 meters, which is just over a mile away from the pass on the eastern slope of the mountain. So a prominent rock outcrop in the area where the event actually occurred now serves as a memorial to the group. This memorial is located 500 meters, or approximately just shy of a third of a mile, to the southeast of the actual site of the group's final camp. If you liked what you heard today, you can give me a rating, subscribe, tell everybody how much you love the podcast. You can find me on all social media at fthatpod, except for Instagram, which is fthat_pod. Don't forget to check out the website, fthatpod.com, and Patreon at fthatpod for archived episodes, ad-free content, a Discord community, and did I say bonus content? I don't remember. Bonus content.